Curtis Kingston from the Kingston and Quinte Citizens for Accountability. Friend here, Terry. We're here today at the 5th and final Highland Shores Children's Aid Society meeting. These meetings were set up in theory for the Children's Aid Society to inform the public on things that are changing, and also to have question and answer sessions. Now we're in the small town of Milford, Ontario. Yet again, similar to Ameliasburg, kind of out of the way a little bit. Yet again, I mean, the issue of transportation for people that want to be here because it is so remote. As you can see, there's not very many people here, other than we'll see the nice Children's Aid cars. Anyway, well, we're going to go in. We're about half an hour early, so we'll hang around, and I know that there's a couple other people going to be here, and so yeah, we'll see how it goes this time. I know last time I was actually quite impressed with the people that had the knowledge that they did in regards to Bayfield group homes and stuff like that. So this time we'll see what happens. Maybe we'll get.
First of all, I'd just like to welcome everyone for coming tonight. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to come in here and learn a little bit about what's been going on with Prince Edward Children's Aid Society, and really now what is Highland Shores Children's Aid Society. I'm going to talk a little bit. We've got a bit of a presentation. Brad Bain is going to come up and share on the presentation a little bit. But tonight is really about talking with you, the members of the community, about what's happened, and to be able to spend some time answering any questions that you may have, because I think it's important, and that's what this evening is about sharing some information and giving you an opportunity to ask the questions that you have. As you may have read in the newspaper, on April 1st, we legally amalgamated Prince Edward and Highland Shores. So Prince Edward Children's Aid Society and Highland Shores legally amalgamated on April 1st. Now, Highland Shores doesn't have a very long history itself. April 1st of last year, it was the legal amalgamation of Hastings and Northumberland Children's Aid Society. So Brad's going to show you a map a little bit later on about what the whole geography that we now cover. We've had a number of other community meetings, and actually this is the last in the series of meetings. We started off in Picton in March. We had a meeting in Bloomfield, Ameliasburg last week, and then tonight here. So I guess this is the save the best for last. And did that. And I must say it was quite an enjoyable drive. I haven't been down to this part of the county before. It was quite a nice drive. I'm quite impressed. I'd like to introduce a few of our staff here tonight. We have a number of staff, and our board president, Darcy French, is here. Bonnie Perregard works with us. Brad Bain is the interim director of service. We have Bev Lewis here, and we have Lynn Thibault, who's here as well. And Jen, that's right. Thank you. Sorry. Who hails from this neck of the woods too. So welcome, and thank you for coming tonight. I guess I really want to start as we did back in December when Darcy and I held a press conference, and that was shortly after we started working with the folks in Prince Edward. And that meeting was really about an apology. To apologize first and foremost to the children that we work with. They trusted us to provide them a safe place, to look out for them, and that didn't happen. And for that, we truly apologize. We also need to apologize to the community, because you also, just like the kids relied on us to be able to do that, you as a community entrusted us to have the right kinds of systems and processes and organization in place to make sure that the children were kept safe and protected. And unfortunately, there was some bad things happen to the kids, and that for us is something that we really understand. We want to try and make amends for, and most of all, we really just want to apologize for having that happen. The lives of several young people who experienced harm at the hands of their foster parents and have been forever impacted. There's a breach of trust when that happens, and that's something that we need to take steps to, and part of that in taking steps is more than just saying an apology. It's also saying what it is that we're going to do differently and what we're going to do to make the changes necessary to try and prevent that from happening. So where does the responsibility lie? Many people ask a question about who's to blame for this. And the answer is many must shoulder the responsibility. The society, the board of directors, and the ministry all play an important role in keeping children protected. In the case of these children, that just didn't happen. I want to tell you a little bit about some of the things that we've done, and we're going to talk a little bit about what the ministry did and found through their reviews of the society through 2012, as well as the steps that our staff have taken to fix the issues that have been identified. Over the course of 2012, staff from the Ministry of Children and Youth Services, as well as outside consultants, did a thorough review of many of the practices at the Children's Aid Society. As a result of those reviews, it was determined that some society practices did not meet ministry guidelines. As a result, staff were given deadlines by the ministry to correct those practices, and since then, much improvement has taken place. What I'm going to share with you in a moment is specifically what has happened, but I know many of you will be thinking, shouldn't these practices have been happening all along? And the answer is yes, they should have been. But they weren't. And it's important now not to look back, but to take the responsibility to move things forward. And that's what we're going to do. So before I can tell you what we're doing, I want to share with you what it is that was found by the ministry that needed correction. The slide here talks about poor record keeping. There's an inability to critically assess risk. It was identified that there was no working relationship between departments and the executive director. There were errors in the applications of licensing requirements, and that's for foster homes. There was allegations of abuse in a home that wasn't formally investigated. There was continued placement of children in a foster home that was coded at high risk. There was a child protection investigation of a foster home regarding alleged sexual abuse that was not made in compliance with child protection investigation standards. There was an open protection case with no documented monthly home visits. There's some issue with society placing children who've had a number of issues without identifying those issues to the foster home. There's an allegation that society placed children in foster homes without doing record checks either with the CAS, within the CAS, or with other jurisdictions. And there's concerns about ineffective responses to after-hours calls. Clearly there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But I want to tell you that once these issues came to light, the staff started working on that right from the start. This was we became involved in November. These things started to change. The ministry report was received in January, and almost immediately the changes started to take place. They worked diligently with the ministry, with each other, and with outside consultants to take the steps that are necessary to make improvements to each of those areas. And now I can say to you that they're meeting the standard of care in keeping with other children's aid societies in the province. So what specifically have we done? All the files now are up to date and are meeting the standards set out by the Child and Family Services Act as relates to foster care and child protection. There's an ongoing monthly review of compliance to standards. There's an increased dialogue and oversight between supervisors and caseworkers. We're encouraging better decision-making at all levels of the organization, which has been supported by training and dialogue. There's been improvement in communication and partnership between departments, and specifically between the Child Protection Department and the Resource Department. We've appointed a supervisor in the foster care area who maintains and builds upon the work completed as a result of the ministry review. Talked a little bit about training. We've also created some additional training with an increased emphasis on supervisor and new worker training in all areas, not just in standards, but also in risk assessment. Brad Bain, who I introduced to you earlier, was appointed to the position of Interim Director of Service in December, and he'll be with the Society until the end of June. At which point we will have a senior manager from Highland Shores located in the office. That will be that position's regular person work. Dwayne Stacy is his name, so I can say he right now. Brad's role was to oversee the processes that have already been put into place and to make sure they continue to work effectively and help to make some of these process changes. So really Brad's role was to take the work that's already begun, the momentum that had already built up from the previous executive director, the staff, all of the consultants' work, and continue to move it together, especially as we continue to move forward with amalgamation, because that was the other part of the process. Okay. So much work has been done, but there's still a lot of work to do. I'm going to tell you a little bit now about just the process that got us to this amalgamation. So as many of you know, in November of last year, the Prince Edward Board of Directors announced their decision to explore opportunities to join with another society. They approached Highland Shores Children's Aid Society and shortly thereafter announced that they were going to be amalgamating. In order to assist in that process and really it was an important decision, one that wasn't taken lightly. The Prince Edward Board decided that in order to facilitate that, they wanted to create the ability for the Highland Shores Board to work directly with the organization. So a number of the board members resigned. There were 5 of the 7 resigned to allow 5 Highland Shores board members to replace them. And in addition, there was room in the bylaws, there was a room for 11 board members, an additional 4 were appointed from Highland Shores. Because until there was legal amalgamation on April 1st, there had to be a separate board operating each society. So instead of having 2 separate groups of people, in their wisdom, I think it was a good decision. They allowed basically both boards, but we have the cross-appointed to both, so there wasn't this whole issue of coordinating the work. So it would allow the work to continue. So with the amalgamation on April 1st, that was no longer necessary. Elaine Phillip, who was the previous board chair or board president of Prince Edward, has stayed on, along with the rest of these board members who were on Highland Shores. So you'll notice up here that we also have, in addition to the slate of board members, we also have 3 appointees to the Highland Shores Board. We have an appointee from the Tyndonega First Nation. We have an appointee from Alderville First Nation, and we also have, Tyndonega Mohawk Territory, Alderville First Nation, and then Bruce Knudsen, who's from the Quinte Children's Foundation, which is a fundraising arm of the Legacy Hastings Children's Aid Society, but who now work with Highland Shores. So some of you may volunteer on boards within your community. You know the importance of board governance. The role of the board of Children's Aid Society is of utmost importance. The very nature of governance leaves little question that ultimately it is the board of an agency that is accountable for all aspects of the agency's performance through the executive director. Increasingly, the public is looking to government to demonstrate the results that are being realized for the investment in public funds. The public expects boards to demonstrate accountability. Increasingly, boards of directors are expected by both government and the public to not only understand the performance of the organization, but also to be driving continuous improvements and to be transparent in the results that are being delivered. Increasingly, boards are expected to balance expectations related to provincial priorities, targets, and standards with local circumstances and needs. And that's really the strength of the child welfare system in Ontario, and it's different than other provinces. In Ontario, they are separate from government. In the other provinces, it's directly operated by the government, child welfare. But in Ontario, by having a board of directors that can represent the local community, there's a greater opportunity to influence about taking a common approach, a common set of laws and guidelines, and tailor it to the specific needs of the community. So it's not everything being directed out of one central place. I'm not going to go through this slide. It's a bit busy, and if you're sitting at the back, I'm not even sure if you can read it. I can barely read it from up here. But it does talk about the differences in the roles and responsibilities between the Ministry of Child and Youth Services, the Children's Aid Society boards, the executive directors, and OHSCAS, which is the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies. And it talks about making sure that we're not only set the province-wide targets for the MCOS, but then how to convert those targets and adapt them to the local situation. one of the things that a quote that I'd like to share with you helps to sum up the board role. Board wisdom comes from its broad focus. While staff must pay attention to the trees, board members must look at the whole forest. And that's that part of, from the board, taking that provincial level and then being able to look at that broader piece, then hiring me in to work with the staff about getting into each and every one of those individual trees, or in our case, children and families that we're working with. The individuals who make up the board are members of our communities, and as such represent the voice of the community at the table. The board is accountable to the clients of the society and to the members of this community. They're committed to be as transparent as possible, and given the limits of maintaining the privacy of those the society serves, want to ensure that you understand what is taking place with the society as we move forward. And that's part of the purpose of why we're having these meetings. Because we want to be able to demonstrate to you that what has happened, be very clear about that, be very clear about what the steps that we're taking, and to invite the dialogue as a beginning tonight. Tonight is not an end. Tonight is a beginning of dialogue with each of our communities. And as we start to move forward, and as we look at the years coming forward, making sure that we have good representation across our whole geography on our board of directors, because, as Brad's going to show you, it's a big map of our jurisdiction. Before I turn it over to Brad, I did want to just talk briefly a little bit about the amalgamation and the notion that what happened in Prince Edward is going to be swept under the rug. I know that was one of the things that we read about. And again, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the accountabilities beyond just our goodwill and our efforts to be able to be forthright and transparent, but some of the other processes that are in place that help with that. So, in addition to the board of directors that's elected by members of our community, there are external accountability mechanisms that are in place. There are regular service reviews conducted by the Ministry of Children and Youth Services. There are financial reviews, again conducted by the ministry. There can be service and financial reviews conducted by the Auditor General, and they've done that in our field. There's a complaint process that allows clients to bring complaints forward to a neutral and independent third party, the Child and Family Services Review Board. And that parallels the internal complaint process that we have. Each society is required to have a complaint process that starts right at the time that we get involved with the family to advise them of it. It can end, the internal process ends with an internal complaint panel that's comprised of a board member or members of the community. And if a person is still not satisfied, then that's when they can go to the Child and Family Services Review Board. Or in fact, they can go there directly and not use the internal process. So there are some mechanisms in place. There's also the Advocacy Services for Children and Youth through the Office of the Provincial Child and Youth Advocate, which is separate and apart from government. They're placed there by order in council, which means that they're not appointed by the governing party alone, which gives them some further objectivity and arm's length from the government of the day. And there's ombudsman oversight of the Child and Family Services Review Board. So they have direct oversight of the Child and Family Services Review Board. Now, you may have read in the newspaper that there's been some discussion about ombudsman having oversight of other areas, including child welfare. And right now, that's not the case. They only have oversight over government kinds of things. And because the Child and Family Services Review Board is a government piece, that's why they have jurisdiction over that. You know, I've talked before, and I'll probably get some questions from the floor tonight, right, Curtis, about ombudsman. You know, it's quite simple. I mean, our take on it is there's a lot of review mechanisms now. You know, and in terms of if there was another review mechanism, then what we want to take a look at though is then how can we streamline it? Because adding another layer of review on top of already many reviews, I don't think maybe from our perspective suits anybody's purpose. But if that's going to be something that's more effective, clients and families have a right to be able to talk about those things and to raise concerns in an effective way. And if it's not working the way it currently is, then we want to have that dialogue, but we want to make sure that any solutions that come with you know, making sure that they're streamlined. So I think at this point, you know, just before I turn it over to Brad, you know, I think what I wanted to make very clear to people is that we are taking this very seriously. I'm taking this very seriously. You know, there are some things that happened that shouldn't have, but the best thing that we can do is to acknowledge it, and most of all, move forward and make the changes that are necessary. It's now my responsibility to make sure that children, no matter where they live in our jurisdiction, receive a similar level of service. Now, with the geography that we have, it's not going to be identical, but it should be similar. And no matter where you live or where a child or family lives in our whole jurisdiction, you should have that same level of service. So I'll call on Brad to talk a little bit more about some of our service now.
Thank you, Mark. Well, good evening, everyone. As Mark said, my name is Brad. I'm actually a temporary employee with Highland Shores. I come from Durham region. So I was seconded in late December to come down and temporarily help Highland Shores until June. As Mark has, I think, probably said 2 or 3 times tonight, emphasizing the fact that I will be leaving and returning back to Durham region. In the next few minutes, and my pledge to you is I won't take a lot of your time this evening, but I do want to talk a little bit about our service philosophies as an organization, in particular with respect to the children that we serve, both in our system and in the community. I'll talk briefly about amalgamation and then end it with some service stats. I'll be brief with the statistics because they usually zone people out and you start thinking about other things and nodding off. So I will talk a little bit, but not a lot about them. As with most agencies, child welfare agencies in Ontario, one of our striving goals is that of permanence. Permanence for the children and youth of our communities and those that we serve. And our first option is always family. So our mandate is to work with families to protect the best interests of children and to keep families together. At Highland Shores, we actively resource our frontline staff, so when they're working with families in the community, we can put services in place to help them overcome the challenges that they may be experiencing. We also, of course, are relying on our community, so we use community services to augment that. We do know, of course, that there are occasions where the challenges and needs of families place children at risk, and we have to move in terms of finding some alternate living arrangement. In those situations, our first option is always kin. And what I mean by kin is actually quite broad. So we will look towards grandparents, aunts, uncles, anyone in the family that has an emotional connection to that child. Because our belief is that children and youth are best served living in an environment where they already have a connection to someone. Now, there are, of course, occasions where we can't find anyone in the immediate family, and we will look towards extended community. So we've had success in the past with having children move in, sometimes temporarily, sometimes on a longer-term basis, with coaches, with teachers, with principals. Anyone that has a connection to that child. Where we're not successful in that, we will look towards our next option, which is foster care. Not to minimize at all or negate the tragedies that have happened in our community in the last couple of years, but we do have very many foster parents who are very compassionate, empathetic, caring, and willingly open their homes to children in our community. And for that simple act and their commitment to help children, we thank them. Now, Mark has talked a little bit this evening about our services within the community. And for those of you that are living in the community or have had occasion to be in Picton in the last 3 or 4 weeks, and if you've been past our office, you will have seen the most obvious sign of amalgamation. So, the signage has changed. So on April 1, the Children's Aid Society of the County of Prince Edward came off the building and was replaced by Highland Shores. So on April 1, there was no legal amalgamation. Now, as I'm sure that you can appreciate and understand, amalgamation is a very involved process. We estimate that by the time we combine all of our internal services, it'll likely be January of 2014. But our services will all fall under the umbrella of Highland Shores. As I think Mark did mention, one of our goals is really to be able to provide the same services and supports to children in all their communities. So our commitment, telling you today, is that a Picton office will remain because we want to be able to resource children in their communities. We want to ensure that a child, if they're in this community, or in Picton, or in Port Hope, Bancroft, or in Belleville, all have the same access to the same services and supports. Now, most of you maybe not most, many of you are parents. And you know the awesome responsibility of being a parent. You also know at times it can be overwhelming, and that you have supports available to you. At the Children's Aid Society, we become the corporate parent to many children. And we know that we can't do it alone. And like a parent, I know when my children are old enough, they'll have the access and the resources of the education system. I also know that I have access to a medical system. When I'm looking for things to keep my kids on the straight and narrow and keep them busy, I know I have recreational opportunities. Or if they're struggling, I know that there's mental health services and social services. As a corporate parent, we as an organization are also relying on all of those services to help us effectively parent children in our care, but also to help families in our community. As a first step in that process, about a month back, we met with 11 organizations that serve this county as an opportunity not only to kind of introduce ourselves, but also to reestablish and build partnerships, because we know that we cannot do our job effectively in isolation. So it was a very positive experience, very positive first step towards ensuring that our services are aligned and we can build networks and supports for the children, youth, and families.
So I think I just want to summarize, because we've talked a little bit about what's happened. We've talked a little bit about the steps moving forward. We've told you a little bit about ourselves, and we told you about our commitment. And I just want to reiterate that that's what our commitment is. The slide up there shows a big geographic area. We're up the north. We actually joined Nipissing as our neighbor to the north. So that gives, when I saw that, I worked in Sault Ste. Marie for a while, so I thought that was up north. So we have a vast geography, and of course it's impractical to have people located in each and every community, but we serve each and every community, and we do that in the most effective way we can. And that means that no matter where a child or family lives within our geography, they're entitled to the same level of safety, protection, well-being, and permanence in their lives. And that's what our commitment is to you. And we want to be responsive to you in the community by keeping our eyes and ears open to you. And part of that is what we're going to talk about now, which is the questions that you might have for us that we'd be happy to answer for you. So I'll turn it over to the floor to ask any questions that you might have. Go ahead.
Are you and Brad registered social workers?
No. Brad, are you a registered social worker? No.
In what other capacity could you be working other than social work?
I don't know if I understand your question.
Are you strictly administration, or do you feel that you provide social work duties?
Oh, well, I don't think I provide social work duties very often. Occasionally I talk with people.
Diagnosing, treating, that kind of thing?
No, that's not what my
You don't make assessments?
Not in that way. That's what our frontline staff do, our child protection workers.
So as an executive director, you wouldn't assess a family's file upon a request for an internal review?
Well, depending on what level that it would get to, but usually we have different processes through the complaint process where, depending on where it came in, it might be the director of service, so it might be someone like Brad that would do it, or Tammy,
And again, would those people be registered?
No, not always. They could be.
Then that is a breach of the law. It's a direct violation. It's contravening the Ontario Social Worker Act.
Okay, so there's been a question that's come up a number of times in these sessions, just for the benefit of the full group, that a question about there's some provision in the Act, or there's some confusion about whether or not child protection workers have to be registered social workers. And part of what I've said before...
Could I clarify that?
Sure.
A child protection worker, under the Child and Family Services Act, is authorized to apprehend the child, take that child to a place of safety, and they can also have the child examined. Other than that, everything else is left to a social worker. To provide social work duties, as per the Social Worker Act of Ontario, is illegal unless you are registered. Therefore, sir, you are in direct violation of that act.
Okay, so again, I don't want to get into the technical...
Of course you don't, because you're in violation of the law, which is the main issue that happened with these children. I tried to speak in for the last 8 years as I had direct involvement with one of the victims. I was lied to by every worker almost at the Picton CAS, and this would not have happened if there was other recourses, such as being able to complain on a social worker. They weren't protecting the children.
So there's a couple of things. So I certainly can understand where you're coming, and we've had these conversations before. This is a matter of provincial policy, that it's the Ministry of Child and Youth Services that thinks that they administer the act. There's nothing different about Highland Shores, including Prince Edward, about the qualifications of staff.
Directly breaching the social worker
So that might be an
act.
issue that has to be resolved by the
Sir, this isn't going to go away.
Okay, but
Okay?
I guess I can't
You are in
resolve it.
violation, as we speak,
Okay.
of the law.
Darcy, did you?
And I appreciate your interpretation, but actually, no, we're not. And
Actually, yes, you
well, you had your chance, please let me finish. What has to happen in a case where somebody is not a registered social worker, you apply to the ministry and the minister via a legal venue.
Has that occurred?
Yes, it has. I signed the papers. So you apply to have that person appointed at the ministry's preview. So nothing's been contravened.
So-
And in Highland Shores, trust me, all of our paperwork is.
Oh, I trust that the eyes are dotted now.
Yeah.
However, were the social workers circumvented at the time that this all happened? Absolutely
So what
not.
are you talking about? The appointment of the executive director?
No, I'm asking you, were those applications made when it was Picton Ontario?
So here, let me be very clear, because we're not going to be able to resolve this here tonight, okay? Let me be very clear. The child protection staff at Prince Edward CAS, along with most other CASs, have a combination of social work degrees or they may be registered or they may not be. Our current interpretation across the field in conjunction with the ministry is that people are not required to be a registered social worker to do child protection work. That's the best answer I can give for you tonight. It's beyond us to solve. I think
Why
I
are you
understand
trying
what-
to circumvent the law?
We're not trying to circumvent the law.
But Mark,
you're
you
leaving
did,
out-
You feel
Applications to
yourself that
circulate.
everybody should be a registered social worker?
I don't think it's material what I personally think.
Yes, I
This is a
think
matter.
it's material.
This is a
It's
matter
very-
for public policy. It's not me that makes the decision on
No,
this
it's not
one.
about your decision, it's about how do you personally feel about these children being subject to a non-social worker's discretion or indiscretion? And how are you going to oversight them without any degree or being a registered worker?
Well, registration into social work means that there's a difference between registered as a social worker and having a social work degree.
What do you have to lose
A social
when
worker-
when you're not a social worker, though, if there is?
Okay, so one of the things that I want to do, just for everybody's benefit tonight, I know that there's some emotion, okay?
Sure is.
I want to give you all the
By the
time.
way, all the time. It's
now,
manipulated.
actually, Mark, just before you speak here, you did just say a few minutes ago that all your frontline workers are in fact practicing social work. You just said that. What this lady here mentioned was that the term social work, and you just and what that entails, and you just said no, it would be the frontline workers that do social work. So why would the frontline workers not be registered?
And then you admitted to trying to circumvent it when it does apply. Like, why?
Let Mark speak here. Sorry.
Okay. So, again, I really want to make sure that we give you time to be able to talk about that, okay? One of the things, though, okay, is I'm not going to argue with you guys, okay? I mean, I understand the point that you're trying to make. You're very concerned about the skills and qualifications of staff. Is one thing that I hear loud and clear. The second thing is you're really concerned about there being proper oversight.
Their main
of it.
objectives, personally, as a professional.
One of the things that I'm going to ask, okay, is I want to hear you, okay, but I can only answer one question at a time, okay. So I know I know you have lots of questions, but I'm going to get there. I promise, okay. I'm going to give you all the time, but I want to be able to, because I'm just not. At the end of the day, I'm just not that smart to keep everything all at one point. So what I heard you say is that you're really concerned about having the proper oversight in that, and third thing that I heard you say is that you're concerned that when you have a concern about them, that where are the people that you can complain to, right? That there's an effective body that can do that, especially if the society isn't doing it. Are those kind of, irrespective of what the laws are and those sorts of things, which again, I've already said, I can't change the laws today, none of us can today, but that's something for a different group.
We don't need you to change them, though. We need you to adhere to them.
Well,
It's a
my
discussion.
understanding from across the province and certainly from Highland Shores, I would tell you these things. First of all, we do not believe we're contravening the law, that this issue has been raised with the ministry and the government, it's been well vocalized, okay? If the ministry thought that we should be doing something differently or we were contravening the law, I can assure you they would be doing that. That's not our interpretation, that's a wide interpretation. But it's also subject for debate in the province about what does this mean. So this, I mean, you're making a point, this is an issue, okay? What I can tell you is about our staff. So I want our staff to be very qualified to do their work, okay? That I want them to have appropriate education and skills to be able to work with children and families. I believe that we do that. But we don't get people that way just out of college. That's where we start, and everybody has to start their career. Once they come onto the job, there's some training that all workers go through. There's provincial training that we make sure that all of our staff go through. Okay? There's regular ongoing training once they've been on site. We have supervisors that are in place that are trained and educated, have their own education, have years of experience in different ways, including doing the work I started my career as a child protection worker, not as a social worker, as a child protection worker. When we have issues that are not, according to that, through our complaint process, I can tell you, we do hear people complaining, numbers and numbers, and we resolve most of them, okay? Sometimes we're not able to do that and we have these mechanisms. They're not perfect. I'm not going to stand before you and say that we get it right all of the time or that these mechanisms work 100% of the time. But that's what we have now, and we're interested in trying to find even better ways because people have a right to get the best services that we can. We want to be able to do that moving forward. How that is, we have to work together in partnership with people that receive services from us. We have to work in partnership with the government. We have to do things in a way that actually, because I don't want to have more and more and more oversight things that get in the way of people actually going out to see the people that they're intended to do. Same thing with paperwork. The amount of paperwork that people have to do, when there has to be some. Okay, we talked about they're required. But if we're not streamlined with the paperwork, then people are in their office writing down forms, and that doesn't help people. The help happens when we're working with people and finding a way together, even when we're on opposite sides, because sometimes that happens. We don't always agree on what it is, and that's where there's, I didn't talk about the court process and these other steps, but those are all of the things that we can do. So that's probably the best answer I can give to you about the social work and the regulation and all the rest of it. So if that's okay, I want to hear, I think you had another question, so let me go right back to you and give you another shot then. What's it? But I'm probably not going to go back to that regulation again. Okay.
I have more questions than you can handle.
I probably do, but as long as we take turns, but I want just to be respectful for you.
Why is it a common practice for hospitals to call the society on new mothers or people calling in for help as far as protecting their child from a health concern? Or a new mother having a baby on the hospital, so you have discretionary nurses, or indiscretionary. Yeah. And they are basically, raping your system and costing you lots of money and putting people's dignity on the line. Okay, so I'm not sure to do with that last part of the question, but let me talk about the first part. The first part that you asked me is why is it that nurses call the society when actually, every professional has a duty to report. In fact, every person in the community has a duty to report. And in fact, that's part of the reason that we're having these meetings, is because I'm very concerned that because of what's happened, that people have lost confidence in calling the society. Okay? So every person in the community has a duty to report to the society. But professionals have an additional responsibility, where if they believe that a child may be at risk of harm, that they are required to call the society. And if they do that in good faith, then that's something that the law supports it. And that's really based on the fundamental premise that children are vulnerable. They can't speak for themselves, least of all newborns, okay? And that as a society, we want people to feel, if you believe that something may have happened, to have that very low threshold of calling the society. We get a lot of calls, okay? We don't respond to all the calls. Okay, we have a system that we go through that I'm sure you're familiar with. Okay, and we see if it fits that criteria. Secondly, even if
criteria?
According to the eligibility spectrum, there's a thing called an eligibility spectrum.
If I could mention, I did notice on the HSCAS website, the Ontario Association, it said that they received, I think the number was around 48,000 calls, and they said that only half of those calls were investigated. But I know for a fact in many families that I serve, First off, they say we investigate all.
Okay, so here, let me be very clear about what that is.
So how is half the numbers determined? Like,
Okay.
how is it?
So all of the calls coming in, and there's, within this eligibility spectrum, I'm not getting into far more than we want to get into tonight.
No.
You know, I think that most people want to get into tonight. What happens is that there's a threshold where it says if the circumstances that we're hearing about are above that threshold, we must go out on that. For those that fall below that, then it's up to our discretion whether or not, but generally societies don't do that. And in fact, there's a process where we keep track of how many of those ones that are just below the line. And for those things, the kinds of decision making that we would brought to bear would be, you know, how confident are you in the information that's being brought together? Certainly age of a child is one of the things that an infant is far more likely to be seriously harmed than even, you know, than a school-age child or an adolescent. We know that bad things can happen to infants very quickly. They're very vulnerable. So they're the most vulnerable of all the children we serve. So that's part of the reason. So hospitals are required to do that within their professional judgment if their child is okay, you're telling me to hurry along. So I'll give you one more question. I'm going to open up
What
something.
defines the call for you? Like, you know, a nurse calls in and it's basically a personal discretion, not a professional discretion. And how do you as a society determine that as a professional?
So
Is
that's
their
part of our-
is
that's
their
part of
call
the-
serious, or are you going to just basically
So-
bombard this family? and
So,
nurse them?
okay, so a couple things that we do when we get the information, we get them to tell the full story. We ask them questions back. Through that, we make a determination about, okay, what's happening here? What's that based on? What are the parts that are fact? If it's possible to ask, do you have any evidence for that? You know, the doctor said it. Then that's what they're doing. They have a responsibility. If they're being malicious in their call, that's not something that's allowed under the Act.
What
Okay?
if people can prove that to you?
Okay.
What do you do about that?
Pardon me?
What if people can prove malevolence in the calls? What do you do about that?
Well, then we would listen to that and we would follow up with that. And if it's something that is untruthful and that there's something to it, then we can do that. In my experience, okay, I hear that a lot. In reality, that's not always the case. But again, there's things that we follow up. We do get malicious calls.
Our staff
Occasionally from
members
professionals, I guess. We certainly get it from neighbors and those sorts of folks that we routinely, and we assess that. Darcy?
Ultimately, you have to remember that the conduct of an employee is the responsibility of the employer. So it's not our responsibility to monitor discipline and hold accountable what happens in the workplace in other workplaces. If, and I do know, you know, and I have heard, you know, if it is erroneous and yes, you know, there is a concern, information does get shared. But ultimately, the conduct of one professional group, they have very specific associations, rules, codes, and things like that. So
actually, there's a number of families actually that have to suffer like 6 to 8 months to a year even by the time you get your investigation on. And when you investigate, there's nothing to find. You have nothing to hold against the families.
And then quite often they're intimidated into
Very.
another 6-month service because they're
Just wanna
threatened that you
cooperate.
sign this agreement or be apprehended.
That actually brings me up to a quick question here. Last meeting you mentioned that the majority of the families involved are actually involved on a voluntary basis. And my question to that is, does this number of families involved, do you get that number based on voluntary service agreements? Because I know that pretty much in every single case I've dealt with, the society workers will show up at the door and they will basically threaten the parents to sign a voluntary service agreement, or else, you know, other things may happen. I know this happens. This is my opinion, of course. You're probably going to deny this. But my real question is that number of families that are involved voluntarily, does that come from your voluntary service agreement numbers or from families that actually called into the society asking for help? Because there is a big difference there.
Okay, there's a difference. Where you can say the voluntary and involuntary is the number of court orders, which is really where it ultimately comes down to. If a person is truly involuntary, doesn't want to work with the society, and we disagree, okay, so what isn't captured is sometimes, yeah, no, you're right, that's fine, we'd offer some help. You're not interested, we don't have a reason to stay involved, and we end our involvement then. In other cases, if we feel that there is a concern, that requires our continued involvement, and the family, and we're not able to work out some arrangement. Just because voluntary doesn't mean necessarily always mean happily, okay? This is some tough stuff that we're involved with, and we're not always seeing eye to eye. But if they don't agree, and we feel it's necessary, then that's something that we might have to push to court. But again, the number of matters that are before the court is a minority. We always try and work with families to be able to do that. And again, sometimes people are not, I mean, it's not a good feeling when we're out sometimes. But our job is to try and work with that and to help people go through that and to understand what it's going to take to be able to help them.
But how can you call it a voluntary service agreement when the workers will basically tell them that if you don't sign the voluntary service agreement, we will take you to court? I mean, that's not really a voluntary service agreement.
Well,
that's
I understand,
you know what I mean?
And it is tough, okay? Part of it is, though, it's not so much that it's involuntary or voluntary or a threat, and I can understand how a person would feel that way. But it's also stating the facts, and I think we'd be disingenuous to say, we're really concerned about this, so concerned that we're afraid to go. And we also would say, and you might disagree and give me examples where that hasn't happened, but we would say, you have a right to go to court. We support people. There's legal aid to help with all those things. But at the end of the day, that's another part of the process. If we need to use it, then fine. On either side, the parent doesn't have to agree to things, but that's what the court is there for.
Now,
Okay, I'm gonna let some other people in the audience ask a question. Go ahead.
Can I ask you, and I don't want to minimize it. It's important what you're
Absolutely.
talking about. And I've been there. What I want to know is Highland Shores, okay, I understand nomination, because we went through it here in the county with our municipality. Is Highland Shores, were you guys motivated by the ministry? How did the amalgamation of all of this come about?
Okay.
Was it ministry orchestrated? That's what I want to know.
Orchestrated might be overstated. Can I give you a little
No, ministry orchestrated, come on.
Okay, well, where this came from is, originally there was a commission to support sustainable child welfare. So these are independent folks. In fact, some of them had worked on boards, or sat on boards of directors for Children's Aid, health sector. They reported directly to the minister. Okay, but they were seen as an arm's length as a commission would. The commission studied a number of different areas, and in fact, if you want to go on the internet, there's type in Google Commission Sustainable Child Welfare. They've got their reports up there. Their work is done now, but it started back a number of years ago. And they looked at a number of different things. They looked at the sustainability also meant size. So that was one of the things. They looked at the funding model. We just got a new funding model for that. Looking at how we can do service improvements. That's one of the things that they created a basic structure for, but probably ran out of time, quite frankly. I think that those, and amalgamations were about the size. So what the commission found is that they went through and did lots of research globally, actually, about what the future held for government, etc. And ultimately, at the end of the day, came down to some criteria about children's aid societies that they felt were no longer going to be sustainable. And they set a threshold of about $17 million as a budget size, and a child population of about 25,000, I think. It's been a few years now. But so they identified a number of children's aid societies across the province and wrote them letters saying, hey, we think you should consider amalgamation because if you look at the writing on the wall, what's coming down in the future, you're going to have a hard time being an independent organization. So what happened near us was Northumberland got that letter, and Prince Edward got that letter. Kawartha, Halliburton, and Hastings received a slightly different letter saying, well, you're not of that size, consider partners if they approach you. Now this happened in other parts of the province too. Yeah. So in fact there was 6 sites for amalgamation. Probably the biggest one was a 3-way amalgamation up in northeastern Ontario. So Timmins, Temiskaming, and Kirkland Lake are all now one society. And about 10 or 11 years ago, they integrated within their own communities between like children's mental health and some other service providers became one organization. That was the geography. I don't want to get into all of that. But there was Lanark Leeds Grenville, Frontenac, Lennox and Addington, and then Grey Bruce were the other ones. And there's a few other societies that were identified but didn't have a logical partner to be able to do it. So they sent this letter, then it was the boards of directors that were then made those decisions and discussions about that. There's the ministry helped support that with some funding and some advice and those sorts of things. And ultimately that's how it was forward. I think she was ahead of you.
No, he's
Okay.
right.
Every meeting so far, you've mentioned a bunch of different things, but one of the things I've noticed you mentioned is family court system. You've mentioned it basically implying that it's a fair and just system for families to fight their cases and so on when you guys have a disagreement with them. The problem is that, unlike every family in Ontario that I know of, the CAS has an inexhaustible amount of legal services and representation to fight the family. Okay, this is my opinion. Okay, they seem to have an inexhaustible amount of legal resources. There's also the fact that these legal resources seem to be able to get away with family court rules on a regular basis. They've been proven to lie in court numerous occasions, and they get away with violating this sort of thing, violating court orders from time to time. And this in a sense appears to be set up in such a way to bully the family. I know there's legal aid, okay, but a lot of families, if you have a family with 5 kids, you can only make under $20,000 a year. So getting legal aid is almost impossible. So my question is, how can you possibly believe that family court is fair and just when children's aid societies seem to have an enormous unfair advantage in the courtroom?
It's a good question, Kurt, because I think it is a problem when there's absolutely children's aid societies have much more resources than a family would and legal resources. I do believe in the system. It's the legal system that we have. It's enshrined in law. I believe in the criminal justice system and all those things. Does that mean that they're perfect? Nope. And part of what our role is to try and do what we can to balance that off, and help families do that. And I know we do that all the time. Is it to the level that people would want all the time? Probably not, okay? But it's that's where some of the times that our system works, majority of times, and we even have systems in place and processes in place to help. That's where legal aid does play a role, where we work with it. Why we in fact try and have, besides when you asked before about the families that aren't involved in the court system, why we want to try and get to a place where it's not using that forceful thing, because that's ultimately it's a win-lose in court, right? If we can't get agreement, a judge has to decide you or here, right? That's what it is. If instead we can do things like family mediation is one of the things that we're doing, and family group decision making, and other forms of dispute resolution, and working together and trying to find, okay, we don't agree on everything, but what are the things that we can agree on and try and move that forward? Those are the things that we try and do. So that's where I would say, okay. Is it perfect all the time? Is it easy for people? And that happens in all sorts of things. In family law court, when parents are getting divorced, there might be a parent that has much more resources than another, and it's up to the courts to ensure that people do it fairly, that the rules are followed, and that if people, we don't enforce the rules of court, that's the judge's job, and when people don't do it, they get scolded in court.
Now when you say they get scolded in court, it's very interesting, because there's actually a case that's going on in Belleville right now, where Justice DeLuzio ordered the Highland Shores Children's Aid Society to provide a family with their complete and total unvetted file, okay, for file disclosure. The issue is that it has actually taken 4 months, and the society has yet to comply with the full court order. So why is it that the society appears to be unable or unwilling to comply with court orders, even if a judge has done that? Is that because judges don't appear to actually scald the society for not complying with court orders as they do with families?
So I'm not going to get into an individual situation, okay, because I appreciate that. I know exactly what you're talking about. I know it. Well, I can tell you that there is, the society absolutely is complying with it. Sometimes there's a lot of complications to be able to pull that. There's a lot of information depending on what the requests are and how it's being pulled forward. So, and like anything, we have, even though they're much more extensive than a family would have, we have very limited resources too, and people that we put towards and can put towards those kinds of things. So it takes time to do those things sometimes. And I wish it could be quicker, in all sorts of requests, and I wish we had more resources to do it, because I think we make good use of them. But the fact of the matter is we have a certain amount of dollars that we have to divvy up in all sorts of ways. and we can only put out so much towards those sorts of things. And the court pushes us and understands that all at the same time.
Yeah. Now, does the court, now that the court has ordered that file disclosure is legal, is the society's position that they would actually allow a family to have file disclosure? Because I know that the society up until that point has basically denied every request from every family that I've heard of to obtain their file.
So I'm not sure if I would concur with that, but I certainly know that we provide information in the file. We often work with legal counsel to be able to do that, and routinely do that. So
okay.
Can you prove that? What you just said. Can you prove that you've been complying with parents to the rights to their internal file?
I'm not sure how I would prove that to you.
Numbers, statistics.
Or just simply write a letter on your website saying that they can get their file. Anything like that.
Yeah. Would you deny anyone their internal file? Would you force them to get a lawyer at this point?
No, and in fact, we've not done that before. One of the things that people have to understand, and this is again, there's a statement and then there's the details that are underneath. So one of the things that people are entitled to is information about themselves. What they're not entitled to is information about other people. Because we don't create a file that's based for each individual, because that wouldn't make sense, because we have all the people. Part of the process is pulling out that information, and that's part of the thing that takes a lot of the time. So that's one of the things. Another piece of it is, quite frankly, sometimes people are asking, it's a lot of work to do that. Sometimes people ask for the file because they want something, and that's not really what they want, but that's a way of asking for what they want. So I would much rather give people what they want and give them the answer. Just like you asked me earlier, the thing about the regulation, what you were saying is that you're concerned about people's qualifications and people doing a good job and where to complain after that.
And
that's
discretion.
right. And so I can understand it. So I'd rather give you an answer about that than get into a technical argument about who's regulated. I mean, I understand that might be a way. That might be a way of doing it, but there's other ways about doing it. I want you in the community to be able to have good staff that do their best job with you and work with you to make sure that children are protected. We don't always agree.
So if you can prove that that's not the case, what would you do about that to change that? That you're not working with society to just comply with anything that they're requesting, like just their file or services for their child. I know for a fact a lot of families even phone in for themselves and they're denied and pushed away. They're left to fend and shun for themselves with each other within a family feud without the help of society, and they're forced into family court in on each other whenever they're just begging you for some kind of service when it comes to their well-being, when it comes to therapies or anything else that they're deeming or demanding on each other without your diagnosis. Families are quite aware that a lot of them need help, and then a lot of them phone in for help, and that's the last thing that they get. And so, a lot of families are pushed away from the help that they're asking for and just ignored from the society altogether. And then why are there so many variables to those standards? Because a lot of families can't even sneeze, and they got the SWAT team kicking in the door and apprehending their children almost. So not, technically, but that's just the sense we get when it comes to the variables.
It feels like a lot of, we're either not there when you need us or we're there too much when you don't, right?
Very fear-mongering.
Yeah, no, and that's something that we struggle with every day, because that is the complexity of the work that we're trying to do. It's hard.
It should be
Yeah, absolutely, and there are legal rights and standards, and also the wisdom of the courts and legal. It also talks about what's going to be reasonable and how we do that. And again, it's what can happen, and we know that, right? Is that people can get really caught up in a court process that really is not what anybody's really after. They want to get the services that they need, or they want people under their hair when they don't need it.
Right, but the CIS doesn't agree with the family. That is the only reason. You just move on to court.
And that's but that's part of what it's not just that we move on to court. That's where we try to put in, and that's been fairly recent. So that's all about things like ADR, someone separate and apart from the society as a mediator that can come in. That's meant as a thing, and that's fairly new across all sort of legal
In my personal case, I was referred to mediation. I agreed to it. I endured it. I was completely badgered, manipulated, lied to, threatened by the mediator. All of it, this is in a complaint process right now.
Okay.
However, my incompetent Children's Aid Society worker couldn't even show up to these court-ordered, well, they weren't court-ordered because we agreed to it, but it was through the courts. She couldn't even show up on time. And then she I was the only one out of the mediation agreement actually adhering to the terms that we had agreed to. I mean, mediation is, in my opinion, a waste of time and a waste of money. At first, I thought it would be a great service, but seeing what goes on, I mean, if you don't have the resources, you just get badgered even more. And then if you show up back to court saying that you didn't agree with these mediation terms or whatnot, the judge takes it out on you. You know, it's just, mediation isn't the be-all and end-all.
No. And what you're telling me is not the way it should happen. It's meant, when we have mediation, I expect our staff to be there on time, okay? I expect when they come to you to be there on time. Sometimes things happen, they might have some other emergency that gets annoying, but being out of basic respect, you know, tonight we tried to start on time with everybody being here. That's a basic thing. When we make an agreement in mediation, I expect us to follow it, okay? The other part of it is, if we can't come to terms, and mediators are not supposed to badger, they're not supposed to do that. I mean, again, they're separate and apart from the society. But if you can't agree and there's no other court, unfortunately, that's what the mechanism that society has provided for all of us. When we can't agree in any other way, then we have to go to the court. But you've talked about all of the problems with that too, and there's not an easy answer through this. And that's why I keep coming back with, you know, our commitment is to work with families as best we can to try and resolve it. I expect my staff as well to not just say because a parent says this child's safe or a foster parent says this child is safe, to just take that at face value. Because that's not us doing our job properly. We have
for
to.
Instance, in the past, where you say staff just relaying messages, I reported adamantly that this child was being abused. Ms. Lewis sent the child back to the house. I had to argue for at least a week to get that child taken in. She ultimately was. She was sent to her father. But I don't understand how, you know, we put these calls in. We're expecting the good faith, and then to find out, you know, days later, the child's still in the same abusive situation.
So it's part. See, this is difficult. So I'm not going to talk about this situation again, okay? Because just we don't do that. But one of the things that speaks, it's hard because when you call us, we're going to go out and do our best to assess what's happening and gathering the information. And we've already talked about lots of situations where we're darn right we shouldn't just be going out and taking a child just because somebody calls in. You might be very truthful and believable, and that you might be spot on, but the next person calling in might not. So that's part of what our job is to do that.
Right,
and why we expect
30
people
days to determine that, and that 30 days is never being met. My personal case, and I'm an advocate. I know what, you know, to keep these people in. But I mean, it spirals out of such control. My case went on for 3 years, not one proven allegation. They came in and made a mess out of my personal litigation, which I didn't initiate, my ex-husband did. But CAS, because they were investigating, felt it was appropriate to put in a letter to the court. You know, there was just too many issues where it's unclear.
No, it sounds like it's been a horrible experience for you. And
well,
The double standards, how do you explain them? Like i.e., like a mother works hard, she passes the parenting assessment, she passes all the testing, every hoop that you have to jump through, and here you're still giving the control to the father that has proven himself to be a complete criminal and a mental case.
And at the end of the day, I lost my home, any assets I ever worked for since the age of 11, all through this malicious litigation, where at the end of the day, I still have full custody of my children. Like, come on. 15 years.
A lot of people
there's a question.
Actually, I'm in the same situation as Brenda. I've done 5 years, and I've spent $100,000 on court fees, gone through 7 lawyers. I've lost my business. I've got post-traumatic stress disorder because of what the Children's Aid did to my family, because they allowed my 2-year-old to be in the care of a man who the police had told me to remove my family from this man. He had numerous assault charges, weapon charges. He was in jail at the time that your Children's Aid worker went in against me, who has absolutely done nothing whatsoever, and allowed this father to take the child who is in jail, has no home, but has the right to see this child for 4 days of the week while he's off. He's doing jail time on weekends. So I have fought, because this child is still in the same danger. He brought photographs of guns home the other day. I think I've told you this. He has come home with his face blooded and cut. A few weeks ago, or 2 months ago, sorry, he was reported by the school to the children's aid that the father had shown up drunk. The children's aid did not show up. This has been going on for 5 years, and I have no money left to fight in court. And the children's aid is not there for me. It's not there for this little boy who is now getting psychiatric help because of what you've done. He suffers from anxiety from separation, and he has had a lot of issues because of you taking him from his home and giving him to this man who cannot look after him.
There's a case I know of where they apprehended where the society in Belleville apprehended 3 young children after a warrant request was put in, and the only concern that the Children's Aid Society had was they wanted to apprehend the children for the sole purpose of private interviews with the children. And that was their reasoning to apply for the warrant. The warrant requests were denied by the courts. The Children's Aid Society, hours later, apprehended those 3 children anyway. And their entire purpose, their entire concern, that was their entire reason for apprehending those children, were to facilitate private interviews with those children. If the Children's Aid Society had asked the parents to have those private interviews, or there was a potential of apprehension, the parents would have absolutely given it to them. But no request to that effect was made. The Children's Aid Society apprehended 3 children after the warrant requests were denied, yet the reason the society had was to facilitate private interviews with the children. So they apprehended 3 children, placed them in a foster home. And these children were emotionally abused in that home. Now they come back home and the whole family's destroyed, all because the society decided to apprehend 3 children after a warrant request was denied for the sole purpose of private interviews.
Okay. So
This
again,
is a regular thing that happens with the society.
I can tell you that it's not a regular thing.
I can tell you that it is.
An evidence
It's
before,
not a
now
regular
you're-
thing.
It is.
The majority of families that we work with.
There is a number of people here that will blatantly argue.
Absolutely.
And we have a lot of proof.
Absolutely. And I'm not saying that it hasn't happened. And I don't know the details of it. I'm not going to get into it because I just don't have them.
And you know that people
But
are
can I
calling
finish?
and complaining.
Hang on. Absolutely. And I'm trying to respond to that. What I would say to you is what's supposed to happen in situations like that, and part of our role, is if we have concerns about a child, okay, then by law, we have to go out and we have to assess that, okay?
No,
And again,
no,
when-
you
hang on.
said you had discretion to choose that.
That's right, but when it's above that line,
So you
okay,
admit to
we're
what?
required to do that. When we talked earlier in the thing about the ministry guidelines and standards that we're applying to, and we want that. If the way that the laws are working, why children's aids are there, is that if there's a concern, then somebody needs to go out and assess that, okay? We go out and we do that. If a parent is refusing to allow us to interview that child, and we believe there's reasons, then we have to do that. We have to have a good reason, and we have to justify that. But sometimes, if you're saying, I don't know what happened in this case, but that would be what the expectation would be. And again, I'm not going to get into the specifics about each of the cases, but that's part of what our process is. People do not agree with everything that we do. I can understand that, but that's part of what our role is to be able to go out and assess.
Separate issue.
Okay.
If the doctors are mandated, I mean, this kind of battering against families happen over time. If the doctors have a duty to report, why are the CAS workers, I mean, it's almost standard that as soon as they come in to investigate, they say, well, you wouldn't mind signing this consent so that we can talk to your doctor. And when the family shows opposition, it turns into a mountain, you know. If the doctor has the duty to report, why are these families being badgered to sign these consents? Like, you know, why aren't criminal, I understand that some apprehensions are for at risk. Are all the apprehensions really at risk? Or why are you failing to follow up with criminal charges?
And can you prove that by having doctors and nurses charged with any kind of criminal negligence whenever they haven't phoned you and you just discover something?
There's a provision in the Child and Family Services Act where professionals, okay, where it's an offense to not report to Children's Aid Societies. There's a fine.
Do you have a number, like
Does
a
that happen?
statistic?
A
Do you have
statistic?
for us
Of what?
of that number, reflecting on that?
Because I'm pretty sure most doctors and nurses are hyper vigilant at reporting.
Yeah,
So therefore, it's
they're
counterproductive.
expected to whenever the standard for everybody is.
It's counterproductive to waste more taxpayer money having the CAS worker go and open that family's file at the doctor. I mean, that's just unnecessary. And there's no other
So again,
explanation about that.
if we had a better magic wand or a better crystal ball to be able to
We're
understand
not
that,
asking for crystal balls.
Hey, let me finish. The part of what I understand what you're saying. You're right. It would be great if the only people that we went out and followed up on and knocked on the door were those people where children were at risk. But it doesn't work that way.
No,
Part of our societal obligation, what society has said, is we would rather you do that, as harmful and as upsetting it is to those people, to go out there and check that out and to be sure that nothing's happening, than to be so tight at the front, then you might miss some. And that's what society and what the whole system is built on. We're expected to go out and see far more people than it ever amounts to.
No, most people in this room would agree to err on the side of caution, but it's gotten to a ridiculous point.
Well,
Because of the variables and like, who's going to show up? Is it going to be a good cop or a bad cop? Or what's their main objective? I mean, it should just be a mission. It should just be just what you say. People want to work together to find resolutions, and it's simple as that. That's as simple as it gets.
And we're admitting, that there are issues in some of our families, and we have sought help. I never have personally, but I've supported people seeking help. And boy, oh boy, do they ever run away wishing they never had.
I don't think any of us are against the idea of child protection or children's aid societies in general, or the mission statements that you post on your websites. I think all of us are in complete agreement that that's perfectly fine. The issue is that goes wrong on a regular basis, and we just don't understand why.
And again, I think, I certainly am not going to say to you that we're 100% perfect all the time. Clearly we're not. Part of the meeting tonight is to talk about how we weren't perfect. What I am committing to you is that we want to get better. We want to work. That is the same aim. And you're right. What we have to do is work together as best we can to try and realize the things that we're saying, and we're committed to that. We're not always, that's part of the issue, is that, your perspective and my perspective sometimes aren't going to match. Part of our job is to use our authority respectfully, appropriately. Some of the things you raise are concerns about when it's not being done, and what are the mechanisms to help do that. Absolutely, that's part of the whole system.
And we understand that, but it's hard to trust you and these promised
understand.
changes when you're talking out the side of your mouth, Mark.
Darcy?
Yeah, and I appreciate the questions, but the thing you have to remember is there is a panel of 15 community members who are there overseeing everything. So, are these people who have frontline service? No, they can't. You can't sit on the board if you have an open file, because you cannot manipulate the situation. So I think, the thing we tend to forget here is that this isn't the Wild West.
I wouldn't want to.
But that's the way it's being presented. This isn't the Wild West. This isn't where things go at will, things happen. There are times where it isn't pleasant, and it's never going to be pleasant. We have a lot of discussions about what happens at the front end of the agency. Do I know exactly for 100% sure all the details? No. Do I know the intent? Yes. Have I met a lot of amazing people that work for this agency? Yes. Do I expect them to uphold our standards, which are your standards, which are the standards of the ministry, everybody? We are the final say. He doesn't get, let me finish for a second, then I'll answer your question. He doesn't get to avoid the legal responsibilities. In fact, we hold him accountable. Every quarter, we get a signed document that says everything has been checked off.
Actually, can I stop you there, Darcy, just for a second? The factual certificates is what you're talking about, right?
Yes.
Our group, actually, Canada Court Watch, just obtained through Freedom of Information, through the Ministry of Children and Youth Services, all of the factual certificates sent through Children's Aid Societies in the province of Ontario.
Yeah.
The Ministry of Children's and Youth Services, and I have their letter right here, actually stated that they have not received factual certificates from Highland Shores Children's Aid.
They don't, because they've entrusted us as a board of directors. So, yeah.
So you don't send them to the ministry, you just send them, keep it in your own files.
They have entrusted us.
Okay.
So, but the reality is there are a group of people overlooking this. So it's again, I understand there are not pleasant things that happen in our community.
So you're going to start getting people to file when they request it, and you're not going to give them any problem?
Well, I'm going to tell you something because I am an administrator with the school, and so there are certain things that I do understand, the freedom of information, who gets access to what. You know, you can't come into my school and start taking pictures of every kid in the class, because I don't know if your daughter or your daughter is going to be behind your daughter or son, and where that picture will end up. I am hyper vigilant about what goes in and out of my building. So it's not that clear cut. It's not, again, we've asked Mark, you apply the rules. If they need to be changed or there is something that can be done, often it is done for what is best for the families that we serve. But redacting, basically pulling apart a file, is not easy. And especially if that file might be linked to another file. Right? So then you have to really be careful, because I can imagine what kind of questions we'd get if somebody's information got leaked out.
It should be leaked out though if it's a
If
community
it's not,
problem,
but if it's not
or
that
third
person.
party.
all I know is people have the right to their own disclosure for their own protection. And it shouldn't be a big game of hardball, or you shouldn't lose a bond of trust with the community over it.
No, and there is some inconsistencies because I have my full, complete unvetted file.
But
Well, you would have to vet it.
No, it is unvetted. Thank you.
Then that might not
Do you know how that came about? Because my husband and I were separated. I had requested my copy, and then we got back together, and I said, "Guess what? You're requesting your copy."
There you are.
So Ms.
Fair
Brooks
enough,
wrote
fair
me
enough.
back,
Yeah.
and she said, "I'm not going to waste my
Good,
time."
glad to hear that then. That sounds like a better process. So, are there any other questions? Because I want to maybe draw time to close. And people that haven't had a chance to talk yet, you've had a question over here?
I have many more, but I'll put them to you in writing.
What do you think that should happen to workers that remove important items out of files, alter dates, add stories that are absolutely untrue? You don't put in facts, like say about 5 months worth of files that maybe are only 1 page long after endless visits, phone calls, complaints, house visits, but there's nothing in that file.
So,
What do you do about that worker?
okay, so like with anything, with any kind of employee discipline or performance kinds of things, there's a range of things that happen depending on the severity of it, and that could be anywhere from coaching people to terminating them. But clearly, we expect people to document their files appropriately. We expect them to keep them accurate. That's a requirement of their job. And if people are not doing that or doing something, what you're suggesting is dishonest, not acceptable. But I can't stand up here and say this is what happens, because you'd have to look at each situation and judge it accordingly. But that's not okay.
Then why do you still employ them?
Well, I think I've already covered, depending on what the circumstance is and where it is, and whether or not we've been able to verify that or not. I mean, I think that all of those sorts of things. But I can tell you that it's not acceptable for people to do that. Pure and simple.
It's not acceptable. It's absolutely illegal. But how? It seems to me that I've waited for many years for something to be done about this. These 3 particular staff, and they're all, well, one retired, but she worked there for 25 years before she retired. And this worker had absolutely no credentials whatsoever, and lied under oath and completely fabricated stories for whatever reason is still yet to be known, and retired without any punishment whatsoever. She was completely covered by her supervisors who stuck up for her. And when asked, why was there no hand notes? Why was there no anything recorded in the files? All my answers every time, I don't know. I don't know. And I took it to the review board, and in front of the review board, this worker never showed up. The supervisor did. I don't know. That's all I heard, but there's nothing in those files.
So again, it sounds like we're talking about a very specific thing, and you've talked to me a little bit about that before, and actually so we'd be happy to talk a little bit more. But again, one of the things that I don't do, just like I don't do with people here, is I talk about individual situations, how we do that. That's confidential to them and between the employer and the employee, just like when we work with families and that. But I can tell you that that's not acceptable, and that we would deal with it according to what the situation warranted to.
When are you going to deal with it? It's been 5 years.
Again, I'm not going to speak to you.
And once if we can prove to you that it's like you don't want to discuss individuals' topics and subject, but once if we can sweep together a lot of proof and a lot of numbers, like how are you going to explain that to the public and to at a meeting like this or not?
I don't know. I don't know how to respond to that.
Like, there's a lot of people in this position.
And all of us have
It's
proof.
disgracing the flag, basically.
Again, when part of the process is, if you believe that something inappropriate has happened, that's when you bring it to the worker's attention, if that's the appropriate step, or go right to the supervisor, and that's where the internal process. And I can tell you, and I guess I'm telling you that I've been involved in those. I was a director of service before, I've been a supervisor, I've been a worker. I know and have been through many of those processes where we've changed things, we've sorted things out, we've resolved things. In fact, the vast majority of them turn out that way. That's all I can say. So I can't give you the numbers because I don't have that stat in front of me, but I can tell you in my experience that that's what happens most of the time, not every time.
We just feel it should be a higher percentage, at least over the 50% mark, especially when people are, paying big dollars out of their taxes.
You had a question?
You were speaking about sweeping things under the rug and all of the wrong things that Picton CAS have done. And now that you're High Shore CAS, what would be the complaint process that you would have to go through or follow?
In terms of?
On false allegations, children, there's many cases I've seen in here that know that my children did not deserve to be taken away from me. In fact, I'm sure Beth Lewis knows who I am. After she kicked my door in when I had no clothes on. But it comes overall, remember, on the road?
Okay, so obviously this is...
It's a little deeper than and I want to know, what's the complaint line? How do I follow it?
Yeah,
because when I tried to follow it, I got shut down because her supervisor wouldn't do anything, or anybody else. Well, if this is a totally different case, she's the one that went through my house. She's the one that kicked my door in and showed 5 cops that I had no clothes on.
Okay,
and then turned around and told her supervisor, what? Oh, I asked her if she would like to go and get changed or get dressed, but she declined. 5 male cops in my house, but I declined to go and put some clothes on from the waist down. Yeah,
I don't
remember?
I don't want to put you through this right now.
No, I'm sorry, but you said that you guys were trying to change, okay? I met my worker for the very first time at the Picton Salvation Army on our last meeting. I went to see her the very next day. I'm not supposed to wait for phone calls or anything else. I will be back in touch immediately. It's been 5 weeks and I still have not heard from her. She was supposed to call me back in 3 days. None of this is changing. It's all exactly the same way. It's your job, it's my life, and my children's life. We're the ones separated and you guys are the ones that get a paycheck for it. That's not fair. When you try to complain to proper people, what happens? Nothing. It's shoved under the rug. And I'm the one that's been putting up 21 years of it, and now they all get to sweep out the door like nothing's ever happened, and I still have to fight and wait to get my children done. You come in knowing nothing, seeing nothing, except for thinking I'm some psychotic female. But there's many faces in here that's knowing me. I just left burial. I left this neighborhood at midnight because that lady who sat over there had cops looking in my window coming through my house, and I could not face anybody in this small community. I had to live in my vehicle because they took my kids away from me, and then all she could do was lie.
And I have been
and to see her still work.
I would like to.
Hold on, please. Okay. This is so obviously very upset.
I was very upset as soon as you said she was here.
And I don't want you to have to tell your story in front of everybody around here.
The thing
I'd be
is,
more than happy to talk about it after.
And the thing is, if my story doesn't come out, these people don't know exactly what you guys do to these children.
It was already spread through the town. I heard the rumors.
And I guess part of it is, I understand that, but I don't want how you're feeling today. You shouldn't, this is a private matter for you, okay? You can talk about the issues with the children's aid.
And every time I try to make it a private matter, everybody keeps shutting me up and pushing me off. 5 weeks since I spoke with Andy.
So I'm telling you right now that after, Brad and I will have a chat with you, okay? I'm telling you that right now.
All
Okay?
right.
But I don't want to have to put you through where you, because that's not fair to you. Okay? You shouldn't have to do that.
21
To be able
years
to
of
be
putting
heard.
up with this is not fair to me.
Right.
I did not do nothing wrong, and I did not need to lose my
So
children.
I'm prepared to sit down and listen to you. Okay?
Okay. I'll be quiet.
It's not about being quiet. It's about, I don't want you to have to tell your story in front of everybody. You don't deserve that.
I have a lot of happy communities that live right around here, see the whole thing, so they don't need
But
to.
we don't need to do that. Okay?
What if people want to do it though? What if people want to confront you with their stories and ask you personal opinions to these
Then
guys?
that's up to them.
And ask you why do you use their personal emotions to the children against them instead of for them and for them?
Clearly, people can do that, and if you want to do that, you're
Oh,
welcome
no,
to. But what I don't want to have happen, though, is when people are upset, and because this is so impactful, for people to be put into a position where they feel like the only way that they can hear it, and I know that's part of what you're telling me tonight, is that you feel like you're pushed so far. I'm looking at everybody. Okay, but what I've heard tonight is you're pushed so far that you feel that sometimes you have to be able to talk to everybody. Okay, that's not okay. We want to be able to listen to you. Now, part of that is a two-way, because sometimes I'm going to tell you exactly where things are at, and you might not like what you hear. But that doesn't mean that I'm not listening to you. That doesn't mean that I don't respect what you're having to say, and that I can't feel for you how painful it is, okay? And I want to try and change it for you. And I want to try and change it for you.
It's very
But there's only
painful
so that's something that we have to do together, okay? But for tonight, what I want to be able to do is to be able to have people talk about things that are public matters, that they're not going to say something tonight that they regret later, whether it's tomorrow or next week or next year, about that I want people to be able to have that confidence. But it's up to the individual. You're adults, you make your own choices, but I don't want to have to put you in that
I
position.
wouldn't feel like, and a lot of professionals wouldn't agree with you if you were going to use some big personal passion against them in court when it comes to expressing their valid concerns and questions to you.
I don't think I'm saying that.
Well, a lot of people can reflect that their passion and their emotions are used against them completely, like 5-page documents, 6-page documents in court.
Now, before I congratulate you on actually enduring all this, Mark, I just wanted to ask one other question. When you sign letters, I assume in your office during the day, do you read them all? Because I have a copy of 2 letters, okay, both signed by you personally. The first letter, dated May 2012, I forget when it was saying that the society's intent was to place a person on the child abuse registry.
Yes.
2 weeks later, signed by you, a letter saying how great it was that the same person was involved in children and families and how great they were as a person to join the CAS as a member. 2 weeks later, signed by you, same person. Would you have, I understand that this could have been a mistake, it's an oversight, that sort of thing, but do you get a stack of papers during the morning that you just sign through, or do you kind of breeze through them first?
I read through letters. Now, in terms of the letter about the membership, that was probably a form letter.
A form letter,
and one
yeah.
of the things that we don't have right now is a restriction on people that are on the child abuse registry of be members.
Okay.
Maybe we need to revisit that, but part of what it is, there's some limit. I'm not going to get into the whole child abuse registry thing. We do screen our members for the criteria that they do have to meet.
Mm-hmm.
So the rest of it is a standard form letter about that. And I wouldn't have been able, what you're asking, of connecting
Connect the two dots,
here
yeah.
to here a couple
Okay.
weeks later as a member. So,
Okay.
but no, I read my letters. Last question. Any other questions for people that haven't had a chance to ask?
Okay.
Leave the last question to you.
It's kind of more just a statement. As people are approaching you with frustration, if I could just simply read you 2 quick paragraphs of a letter I received from my executive director, Bill Sweet, at the time. This is what you're going to be. I mean, I was vigilant enough to stay on top of my matters and requested an internal review. And this is what a portion of what I received. Ms. Everall, this letter is in response to your correspondence of October 16, 2006, reminding me of your request for information of my review of case documents on your file from 2003. I acknowledge your request of August 21st, 2006, and apologize for the delay in responding. Your request was included in your letter requesting disclosure of file information, and admittedly, I did not attend to your request. To confirm, in February 2003, in response to your concerns with the decision-making of staff in their work with your family, I indicated that I would review your file. My recall is that your concern centered on your belief that the society was without grounds in intervening with your family, and that the society has contributed wrongly in your children not being in your care for a number of months. But admittedly, oh well, you know, so this is some of why you're getting very passionate responses.
And you could probably gather up a few other people, like, there's at least 300 that would just...
And it goes on to highlight his extreme dysfunction. Okay, so there's been a lot of families here that did try to remedy...
People aren't getting ripped off for
problems.
cars around here. These are our families. Our future for our country.
And in my advocacy, I do have to admit that I see the tensions building, and your workers better start going in pairs, or at least with a video camera, because one of them, I fear, will be harmed at some point, because you are ripping children away from their natural biological environment. And at some point, harm is going to come to a worker that unjustifiably does that.
Well,
I find it very funny, though, actually, now that Brenda mentions this. Okay, yeah, yes, certainly.
Serious kind of thing that I want to attend to. You know,
Yes.
I need you to know that, you know, certainly, you know, my job is to make sure that we do the best job possible, that we have trained people, that we have the right systems and processes to help with our decision making and to help check that out. But at no point am I going to put one of our staff in harm's way. If I'm concerned about that, and certainly my expectations of families, and I think part of what it is, but that's not the answer. And I have enough confidence in the families and people that we're working with that that's not going to be what comes. That cooler heads will prevail. Thankfully, that's one of the things that always is a concern for us. And when we are worried that people might be, we do sometimes pair up. But that's never going to be a solution. And quite frankly, regardless of what people are doing, assaulting one of our staff members, we would push that as far, because that's just not acceptable. Just like nobody deserves to be. We have to work. We have to work on the issue that's
I see increasing as an advocate.
Yeah, well, and
I'm hearing more and more and more threats that if this worker comes and takes my child, and a lot of these people, I'm really kind of believing.
Okay. Well, certainly I'd appreciate the heads up on what that might be, because I don't want to put any of our staff in that way. I think you probably, I'm sure you don't want that.
I certainly wouldn't want to
and
see
I think,
any
as an advocate, part of what you're trying to say is that you want to be able to hear and to change some of the pathway. And certainly, I've told you what our commitment is and what my commitment is, where we want to go, what we want to do. We're not always going to be seeing things on the same page, but I can absolutely assure you that what we want to do is to be able to work with families, to understand, and we have a job to do. It's a job that's mandated in the legislation. It's a very serious job. It's one we take seriously. I have confidence in our staff. They have taken the reins about what needed to change. We would all expect that, having what people have gone through, but I can say without equivocation at all that people are saying, yes, we are going to change, we are going to move forward. What are the things that we need to do, and are continuing to do that now? It's going to be a process, okay? And it's going to be a process for all of Highland Shores about how we get better and better and better to help the children and families that we serve. That's what our job is. And that's what the first order of business is, and that's what we're committed to. And we are building into our processes ways, and we haven't got them all figured out yet, but through our planning processes and some other ones, about how do we get feedback on a regular basis. I said at the beginning of tonight, that tonight is the beginning of the conversation, not the end. I mean that. We have to find different ways. Probably not going to be able to come every week to do a town hall. Connection points, and we can do that. And I want to check with you. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight, for sharing your thoughts and opinions candidly. I appreciate that. There's lots of preparation for tonight. I appreciate that. And what that tells me is that you are sincerely trying to change things. You want to be heard, okay? But I also saw in some of your answers a willingness to sort of, okay, how can we work together on that? And that's what I want to be able to do with each of these departments. And I know that we have to show the way ourselves a little bit and lead that way, but hopefully we can come along together. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you again.
Thank you, Mark.